The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Monday evening, July 10th. Hope everybody's having a fantastic Monday, a beginning to your week. And we're going to talk today some more about the Russian war. I know I've talked a lot about it, but I wanted to kind of summarize a few things and really respond to some really disturbing, I think, tweets that I saw over the weekend from all kinds of people, obviously almost all of them on the right, or even some people who consider themselves objectivists. Just completely bizarre, some stuff completely bizarre, some more nuanced, but I thought it would be good just to lay it all out kind of all at once rather than to just dribble it out. So I want to cover kind of the whether there is moral equivalency between Zelensky and Putin. Are they the same? Because I heard I got so many tweets about there's no difference between Zelensky and Putin. They're basically the same. And then is there moral equivalency between Russia and Ukraine? Are they both equally bad? Are they both equally responsible for this war? Is there moral equivalency there? And then finally, what are American interests? Should America be helping Ukraine? Should it be supporting it? Should it just be moral support? Should it be financial, military support? I mean, numbers were thrown out. I don't know, we're giving them $100 billion. Is it worth it? What's our interest? And then lastly, I don't want to address the one other issue that was raised, and that is, even if Ukraine is right and Zelensky is a good guy and there's some American interest here, I mean, we're heading towards a nuclear war. World War III. This is just a way to get us into World War III, and it's never worth it when you consider that we're talking about a nuclear war. So I thought those are a few issues that are worth just putting together in one show. And having it out there so I can reference it when I tweet about it, and you guys can link to it or share it or whatever as you get into discussions with friends, family members, or whatever on the question of Ukraine and Russia. All right, feel free to ask questions about anything. Obviously, in particular about this to kind of help guide the conversation. That'd be great if you have any questions, concerns, issues you'd like to raise with regard to this. Feel free to jump in. Super Chat is open and available for those questions. Those of you who might be watching on Twitter or Facebook or something like that, feel free to jump on over to YouTube where you can actually ask questions. And then, if you have comments or anything, but please use the Super Chat, because that way it's easy for me to keep track of it and to notice it and to see it. So whether it's a $2 Super Chat or $20 like Jennifer just did, or a $500 one, I don't think you can do more than $4.99 or $500. All accepted, although ones above 20 get priorities, and certainly the higher the contribution, the more priority you get. So, but feel free to use this as a way to support the show. Hopefully, there's a value for value here, and a value for value here represented by the show, and you can express your value in return. Through the Super Chat. All right, let's see. One other thing I wanted to gloat just a little bit. I said this morning that I expected that Sweden will be admitted into NATO. It's basically a done deal. OCON on his way into Vilnius in Lithuania for the NATO meeting today. I've been saying that Sweden will be admitted into NATO for well over a year now. I've said OCON's objections will be dealt with. There's no way he's holding it up. There's no way he's going to prevent this. Anyway, OCON in Vilnius, when he arrived for the NATO summit, basically said, drum roll, please, that he is withdrawing his objection to Sweden joining NATO. And guess what? I think he's going to get those F-16s from the United States, those refurbished F-16s from the U.S. So another sign, another indication that Putin is losing. If Putin was concerned about NATO, if Putin was concerned about Ukraine becoming a NATO country, then since the war began, NATO has added Finland, which has a longer border with Russia than Ukraine does, and a history of pretty well fighting the Russians pretty well. And Sweden, which has a pretty significant, advanced, and sophisticated weapons manufacturing industry. Both of those countries are far more significant than Ukraine in terms of a threat to Russia, and yet he hasn't invaded them, and now they're joining NATO. He won't be able to invade them. So I think that kind of settled the fact that strategically the Ukraine war is a massive failure for the Russians. Of course, the pro-Russian side will never, ever, ever admit failure. Never. No, Putin's a 4D chess genius who's outthinking everybody. And nothing that happens, nothing strategic that happens would change their mind in terms of Putin's genius and the fact that Russia is winning this war. So yes, Sweden is joining. We'll see what I guess. What's his name in Hungary? Can still block this, but he won't. He's too dependent on the EU. He's too dependent on subsidies from the European Union to really get into a serious fight with them. So he will not block it either, and Sweden will be a member of NATO. All right, so a few of the arguments. So a few of the arguments that I saw on Twitter over the weekend, and let's take them let's take them one by one. And I do want to come back to this question of failure, of complete and utter strategic failure. Now, I will say this. I did do a talk at OCON that covers much of this material, some of this material, from a different perspective. And I will be posting that talk as soon as AOI posts it. So hopefully soon. I've asked for it to be a priority because it's so timely. So there will be more material on this. And the OCON talk is probably better organized, although it is different. It will cover slightly different material. So let's start with this idea that, why criticize Putin when at the end of the day, Putin and Zelensky are both the same? And it actually went further than that. One of the more interesting arguments that quite a few people made is all politicians are the same. And maybe more specifically, there's no difference between Putin and Biden. There's no difference between Putin and Biden. Except, of course, as Donald Trump would say, Putin's a lot smarter, right? So let's evaluate this. Now, we know a lot more about Putin than we do about Zelensky. Zelensky's only been a president of Ukraine for a few years. He hasn't really had an opportunity to significantly change Ukraine. He inherited a particular political regime. He's made very few changes before the war. It's not clear exactly the direction he was heading towards. Remember, Zelensky actually won the election. A part of his platform was better relations with Russia. That didn't work out too well. Obviously, that failed. But Zelensky, we know little about him. We know that he was backed by a particular oligarch, and that many during the campaign claimed that he was in this oligarch's pocket. We know that this oligarch, as all oligarchs are, because partially they got their name out of this, from this, is corrupt, and that there's a lot of corruption within Ukraine. Ukraine scores pretty low on the corruption index. We know that in terms of, we'll get to Ukraine more generally in a minute. We don't know that much about Zelensky in terms of the level of personal corruption that he has. People on Twitter seem to be insisting that he is super corrupt, that he is, scamming the Ukrainian people, and I guess all the donors. I've looked and searched. There's very little evidence to suggest that he is corrupt in that sense. Sadly, he has not exhibited, particularly given from the beginning of the war, on a great respect for free speech. He did impose a draft and restricted the ability of men, I think, under the age of 40, from leaving Ukraine. So there is conscription in Ukraine. Of course, the country was invaded, and it is at existential risk. And almost every country in the world that I can think of, including the United States, would probably impose conscription, would probably impose a draft under such circumstances. But it's definitely a black mark in my world, because I'm as you know, very much against conscription and very much against the draft. So let's see, what else do we know about Zelensky? I mean, he's a comedian turned politician. He won the election, as far as we can tell, fair and square. There were no real complaints in Ukraine about the legitimacy of the election itself. Somebody said he banned alcohol. I haven't heard that. So Zelensky banned alcohol from Ukraine, from all of Ukraine. They don't drink alcohol. That seems pretty hard to believe. I'd love to see a link to that. But they've banned at least three media companies that were part of the opposition have been banned from coverage. The opposition is not, this is not a free country, and Zelensky is not a champion of individual rights. Absolutely. But in terms of total mobilization of military age men, 16 to 60, 60, God, that's old. And every time you see pictures of of Kiev, and you see people walking around, lots of men are walking around, so it can't be total mobilization. But they clearly mobilized quite a few men, and they restricted the ability of men to leave Ukraine. So again, a black mark. But again, I don't know a single country in the world, literally I don't know a single country in the world, that would not do the same thing, exactly the same thing, under the same circumstances, having been invaded by a much more, at least on paper, much more powerful, much richer, much bigger army than itself. Let's see, what else? As far as we know, Zelensky he hasn't really spoken too much about, you haven't heard anything mystical coming out of his mouth. He's not a big proponent of the Ukrainian national spirit, going to save the world. Again, we don't know much about him, but he doesn't seem to be a rabid, dictatorial, power-lusting type. Just my impression. And from the Ukrainians I've talked to, their impression. I'd say in the first few days of the war, and since then, really, I can't think of any leader anywhere in the world who in those kind of circumstances would have done a better job. I mean, give me ammunition, not a ride, is a fantastic line that'll go down in history. He has exhibited a massive courage. He has, been to the front line. He has stood with his soldiers. He has rallied his own people. He has motivated them. Again, squabbles within the political elite in Ukraine, absolutely. There's been fraud, but interestingly enough, at the beginning of this year, there were massive fraud investigations, even a raid on Zelensky's own oligarch. His oligarch sponsor was raided as part of the corruption investigation. Again, I don't know that he's not corrupt. I have a low opinion of politicians in general. But I'm just saying, we know very little about this corruption. It doesn't seem on a massive scale. And I have to say, I think he has conducted himself during this war in a truly admirable way. I'd consider, overall, Zelensky to be a heroic leader of his country in a time of war. And by the way, a lot of these restrictions on media, a lot of these other restrictions, suspended an election, this is pretty standard stuff, again, in most countries during wars, having been invaded. He's not, again, a champion of individual rights, but he's a champion of self-defense. He's a champion of his own country. He stood up to a much stronger, much more powerful force with real courage. So in my book, Zelensky's, I don't know, as a wartime president, probably an A. As a regular, probably a B plus, because you have to give him discredit. You have to take off something for the conscription. But again, everybody would have done it, so there are no A's. Normal time president, probably a C. And not bad for Eastern European country that has been under the thumb of the Russians, really forever. Now compare this to Putin. Putin's been around for 20 years, 23 years, since the early 2000s. He's been running Russia since then, even though he wasn't nominally president. Medvedev, who was president, was basically his puppet. During that period, he did manage in the 2000s to stabilize a significant decline in Russia's economy. He managed to eliminate kind of the overt violence in the streets of Russia between the different mafia oligarch bosses by clamping down on them, but ultimately institutionalizing them, bringing them into the regime. And as a consequence, we saw rapid, GDP growth and GDP per capita growth from 2000 to about 2007, and then again, through 2013. Much of this is a consequence of his almost single-minded focus from an economic perspective on the vast natural resources that Russia had. Most of the natural resources, he brought in foreign companies that developed those in the early to mid-2000s, and then, basically stole much of their property or much of their intellectual property and nationalized it, or didn't nationalize it, but put it under the auspices of his oligarchs, under the auspices of the Russian energy companies that were run by his people. Since 2000, he has basically run a mafia government, a government where all economic assets are basically divvied up among his cronies. He has worked to destroy people he disagreed with, including oligarchs who he did not deem as loyal enough to his regime. He destroyed them. He basically took all their money and in some cases killed them. Since 2013, GDP per capita in Russia has declined significantly. Quality of life, standard of living has actually declined. And to a large extent, the Russian economy goes up and down with the price of energy, with the price of oil and natural gas. He has basically staked the entire economy on oil and natural gas, mimicking not the United States, not Western Europe, by building a diversified economy, but mimicking basically the Saudis. He has run one of the most corrupt countries for 23 years, not for a few years. For over 23 years, he has run one of the most corrupt countries on planet Earth. And indeed, his corruption is legendary. He is said by multiple sources to be the richest man in the world, richer than Jeff Bezos. Indeed, he is said to be worth over $200 billion. But that is not even the greatest form of his corruption. Because think of all the oligarchs that surround him, each worth billions and billions and billions of dollars. All of it, basically held together by the use of state force. There is no market economy in Russia. There is no market competition. These oligarchs hold what they hold because Putin has granted them implicitly a monopoly, a government-sanctioned, government-protected, government-guaranteed monopoly. Well, unless they piss Putin off, and then that monopoly might evaporate, and they might fall out of a window. So Putin has siphoned off hundreds of billions of dollars to himself and to his cronies. He has basically full control over all the levers of government. Elections in Russia are symbolic only. Whereas you could argue that in Ukraine, Zelensky has actually worked to limit some freedoms of the press. Ukraine still has an opposition press. It has opposition media. Such media does not exist anymore in Russia. And indeed, since Putin came to office, he has been shrinking the opposition press in a systematic way. The only media and press that exists today legally in Russia is pro-government. There is no freedom of the press under Putin. Putin's regime, Putin himself, has ordered the murder of several of his political opponents. Those who he has not murdered, he has jailed. Putin has engaged in several wars. The first one in Georgia in 2008, completely instigated by surrogates of Russia in some of the Georgian provinces, ultimately involving a Russian invasion into Georgia and a war with the state of Georgia. That was in 2008. In 2014, we all know, 2013, as early as 2013, the instigation of the so-called independence movement in the Donbass and Luhansk provinces, which was all funded, armed, and encouraged by Russian authorities. And ultimately, just the taking, just straight out taking of Crimea. All of this under Putin's guidance. Putin is a dictator. He's an authoritarian dictator. There is no freedom of speech in Russia. There is no opposition in Russia. And Russia is a place where you're afraid to say the truth. I've told you my experiences in Russia. The one time that I said Putin is a thug, and the kind of response of the audience, the fear, and I was told to be very, very careful. This is years ago. Can't say the same thing about Ukraine, where there's regular opposition to whoever is in power, and where there is plenty of opposition media, maybe a little bit less right now because of the war. Ukraine, generally speaking, becoming freer. Russia, generally speaking, becoming less free. While Putin did not impose complete conscription and total mobilization, he did impose some conscription and some mobilization. And if his country was under threat, if his country was actually being invaded, there's no question he would have engaged in total mobilization, and he still might. Who knows? According to Freedom House, which kind of evaluates countries on a global score in terms of freedom of the media, freedom of equality before the law, as well as certain economic freedoms, Russia has a score of 1.79 out of 100. Has a democracy score of 1.1 out of 7. This is a decline from it used to be 5 out of 100. Now it's 1.79 out of 100. In terms of the global freedom score, Russia scores 16 out of 100. Internet freedom score, Russia scores 23 out of 100. Ukraine is not great, but in every one of those, Ukraine is dramatically better than Russia. Instead of 16 out of 100 for global freedom, Ukraine is 50. Instead of 23 out of 100 in internet freedom score, Ukraine is 59. In terms of democracy percentage, it's 39% as compared to the 1.7. 1.7, Jesus, 1.7 is one of the lowest in the world in Russia. And it's a 3.36 out of 7 instead of 1.11 out of 7. By every parameter, Ukraine is freer significantly than Russia is. And yet, we live in a world in which a significant portion of people, on the right in particular, and on the left, the right, extreme right, the new right, and on the left, think that Putin and Zelensky are the same. Zelensky has not poisoned anybody, has not killed anybody, has not used radioactive agents to murder people. Zelensky has not, as far as we know, murdered his political opponents, put them in jail, as far as we know. Zelensky is not the richest man in the world. Putin is. So, the differences are vast. Now, is Zelensky corrupt? Probably. Is Putin corrupt? Certainly. Is Biden corrupt? Probably. Is Putin corrupt? Certainly. Is Putin's corruption, given his murdering people, given the way he's ruled this country, worse than Zelensky's? Yeah, orders of magnitude worse. Can one say, certainly in the context of one country invading another, that Putin is evil and Zelensky is okay? Yes, Putin is evil. Zelensky, for now, is okay. Can one even say, and I know this is going to get me in big trouble, I expect a significant decline in subscribers after I say this. Can one say that Putin is evil and Biden is okay? Oh my God. Yes, Putin is evil. Biden, not on the same scale. Corrupt? Sure. Helping his son out inappropriately? Sure. Killing his political opponents? Nah. I don't think Biden's doing that. Siphoning off hundreds of billions of dollars? Maybe I'm exaggerating. Tens of billions of dollars? Nah. I don't think Biden could do that. Biden, by the way, has been in politics forever, and he hasn't managed to accumulate that kind of money. $5 million that he might have been paid by the Ukrainians, small change as compared to what? In terms of cronyism, you think America and Russia are on the same planet? Russia, basically the entire economy is crony. Everything goes through Putin, and he probably takes a cut. I'm sure Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush, and every other single president of the last 50 years has done favors for his friends. Oh my God, Hillary. Hillary. I guess Hillary's the real devil. Okay, so let me say this. So Putin is evil. Hillary, probably not okay, but bad, but not evil. Not on the same scale. Not on the same scale. Really bad. Not on the same scale. Not as rich as Putin. Not as corrupt as Putin. Not as killed as many people as Putin. I mean, maybe is more incompetent than Putin, I'll give you that. She is quite a bit incompetent. Anyway. Oh, now you're going to add Pelosi and all of them. No American politician is as corrupt and evil, both in terms of, well, I'll put aside ideas, in terms of their actions, than Putin is. How about that? That covers Pelosi, it covers Clinton, it covers all of them. No American politician that I am familiar with, that I know, is as evil in action as Putin is. Now, Putin's ideas are also evil, but there, I think he's got his match in the U.S. I think there's several politicians on the left and on the right that have ideas that are as evil as Putin, whether it's the real authoritarian socialists on the left, or whether it's J.D. Vance or Hawley on the right, who have the same kind of mystical views on the right. Now, let me add about Putin a few things, which I don't think are true to Zelensky, just to give you some more color on this. Putin is a mystic. If you read Putin, and if you read the philosophers that Putin reads, whether it's Dugin, which we've talked about, or Ilyan, I think that's how you pronounce his name, or Lev Gumilev. These are the people that Putin really admires and really believes in. And according to these people, the Russian people are special. They have something called passionanost, something like that. Anyway. And what is this? This is a biocosmic inner energy or passionate substance that gives Russians a certain spirit. It gives them a power and a youthfulness that doesn't exist. And Putin's developed over decades a vision of the world that is completely paranoid. He believes the world is against him, all dimensions, and is trying to restrain Russia, trying to destroy this mystical spirit. And this has been going on for centuries. This is not just now. But Russia is superior. Russia will withstand this. Russia will win in the end. And Russians know this and are willing to die for this cause. Now, you know, this is an idea of biological genetic determinism, racism. And there's something about the Russian culture, the Russian people, that is truly unique. And as a consequence, Russia is destined to rule, destined to be an empire, destined to control Asia and Europe, destined to cover from the Pacific to the Eastern Atlantic, all the way out to Portugal. This is Dugin's vision, which ultimately Putin shares. He believes that this is not only a function of this special, unique spirit, mystical as it may be, of the Russians, but it's also part of the responsibility as the Christian Orthodox Church. See, what happened when the Byzantine Empire fell is that the mantle of leadership over Eastern Orthodox and opposition to the Catholics and ultimately the Protestants. The need for a true Christian faith, that responsibility to maintain a true Christian faith passed on to Russia. And the Russians truly believe that they represent real Christianity, that their faith is the true faith, and that they will defeat the Catholics and the Protestants and all the other apostates. Again, it's hard for us to think in those terms, but this is what they really hold. They really believe this stuff. They're religious, they're mystical, they're superstitious. This is Russia more broadly. And they despise the West. One of the things that maybe are strongest is with Putin is every single speech he gives. He talks about, well, before we get to that. Part of this mysticism is Putin's view that Ukraine is part of Russia. That Ukrainian people are Russian people. Not just the ones in the East. And that Kiev is a Russian city. Indeed, Kiev was the first city of the Rus, the predecessors of the Russians, the Rus. Kiev was the capital. Before there was ever a Moscow, before there was such a city, Kiev was the capital of the Rus Empire. Kiev is the heart of Russia. Kiev is Russian. It's spiritually Russian. It's mystically Russian. And its people are Russian. So in 2021, I talked about this in my talk at OCON. In 2021, 6 months, 7 months before the war, Putin wrote an essay. Let me just find this one second. Yeah, the essay is called, this was in July 12, 2021. It was published on the Kremlin's website. You can find it on the Kremlin website. They actually published it in English with their own translation. And the essay's title is called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. I mean, Putin's not hiding this. He's not hiding his intention. I mean, people might choose to ignore his intention, but Putin's not hiding it. He writes, quote, "Our spiritual, human, and civilizational ties formed for centuries and have their origins in the same sources. Together, we, Russians and Ukrainians, have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people." They're one people. Of course he's going to go to war. Of course he wants to conquer Ukraine. It's part of Russia. They're one people. They're one nation. They're one spirit with one mission: to save the world from itself. Indeed, Ilyan, I think that's the name is pronounced, and Dugin, and Dostoevsky, and many, and Gumilev, all believed that Russia has a unique responsibility, a unique role in human history. And that is the same role that Jordan Peterson believes Russia has under Putin. That is to save Western civilization, to save the West from itself, to destroy liberalism, to reestablish traditionalism, to reestablish conservatism, to reestablish Christianity. I mean, Dostoevsky talks about this 100 and something years ago, 150 years ago. Russia's job is to be the place in which Christianity is reborn as a cultural force in society, and to show the world the power of Christian faith, to show the world the power of Christianity in shaping a great people and a great nation. They believe this stuff, and this is what motivates them. And yes, Putin did not want NATO in Ukraine. Why? Because he always wanted to take over Ukraine. He always wanted Ukraine to be part of Russia. And NATO would have gotten in his way. It's not that Putin was afraid of NATO. It's not that Putin was worried about NATO being on his border. NATO's already on his border. What worried Putin is that if NATO was in Ukraine, how was he going to take it over? He always planned this. He always knew this was going to happen. This is part of his mission. Indeed, if he had taken Ukraine and the West had just folded, as it did with Crimea, as it did with Georgia, then he would have tried to take Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, which have significant Russian populations. He would have gone back to Georgia and finished the job. Georgia's not a NATO country. Estonia, there's a risk. Lithuania and Latvia are a risk because they are NATO countries. But there's no risk in Georgia. I mean, what Putin wants is to reestablish the Soviet Union. What Putin wants more than that is to reestablish the Russian Empire, which is even bigger than the Soviet Union. What Putin ultimately wants is what Dugin wants, which is take over, ultimately, dominate Europe, whether directly or indirectly. What motivates Putin is a combination of mystical sense of grandeur, power lust, and belief in a mystical destiny, combined with fear of his own people. Fear that he was losing his grip on the regime. Remember, from 2013 on, economics in Russia was not good. And he was afraid of his own people, afraid for the health and the survivability of his own regime. War is a tonic, brings people together. I mean, Russia's such a wonderful place that as soon as the war started, hundreds of thousands of Russians left, even though they won't be threatened. Most of them because they didn't want to get conscripted. Most of them because they didn't want to serve under the great Russian cause. Indeed, one of the missed opportunities among many that the United States had is not giving them visas. Bring them over here. All those talented engineers and scientists, we could have used them. Could have given them a free life. Putin's a conservative. Listen to this, and this is why the right likes him so much, because he's a traditionalist. Listen to this. This is from a 2013 press conference. He says, society falls apart without traditional values. Clearly, one must come back to them, understand their importance, and move forward on the basis of these values. The point of conservatism is not that it obstructs movement forward and upward, but that it prevents the movement backward and downward. That is, in my opinion, is a very good formula. And it is the formula that I propose. Russia is a country with a very profound ancient culture. I don't know what's profound about its culture. I have no idea. And if we want to feel strong and grow with confidence, we must draw on this culture and these traditions and not just focus on the future. Now, that sounds like half of the Republican Party, maybe 3/4. No wonder they like him. And, you know, he hates the West. Listen to this. Looking at what is happening in a number of Western countries, this is from a little later from a speech. Looking at what is happening in a number of Western countries, we're amazed to see the domestic practices which we fortunately have left, I hope, in the distant past. Right? And then he says, the conservative, let me just say, the conservative approach is not about an ignorant traditionalism, a fear of change or a strained game, much less about withdrawing into our own shell. It is primarily about reliance on a time-tested tradition, the preservation and growth of the population. Not very successful given that Russia is one of the fastest shrinking countries in the world. A realistic assessment of oneself and others, a precise alignment of priorities, a correlation of necessity and possibility, a prudent formulation of goals, and a fundamental rejection of extremism as a method. And frankly, in the impeding period of global reconstruction, which may have been quite long, with its final design being uncertain, moderate conservatism is the most reasonable line of conduct as far as I can see it. He's a conservative. And one of the things conservatives do is they hate They hate gays. They hate homosexuality. And he goes on and on and on in speech after speech after speech to denounce homosexuality. This is what really makes him appealing to the West, to Western conservatives. So, and I could go on and on and on. With quotes from him. I mean, where he thinks it's the West is pure Satanism. Here's a good. This complete renunciation of what it means to be human. This is him talking about Western values. The overthrow of faith and traditional values and the suppression of freedom are coming to resemble a religion in reverse, pure Satanism, exposing false messiahs. Jesus Christ said in the Sermon on the Mount, "By the fruits ye shall know them." These poisonous fruits are already obvious to people, and not only in our country, but also in all countries, including many people in the West. This is the Western conservatives who love him. So he, as I mentioned in my show on Jordan Peterson's comments on Putin, many people in the new right in the West view Putin as a bastion against the left, as a bulwark against LGBTQ. They view him as a representative of traditional and conservative values as religion and faith. Again, this is from Putin criticizing the West, and this could be Jordan Peterson. Do we want to have here in our country, in Russia, parent number 1, parent number 2, parent number 3? They've completely lost it. Instead of mother and father, do we want our schools to impose on our children from the earliest age school perversions that lead to degradation and extinction? Do we want to drum up their heads, their ideas, that certain other genders exist along with women and men, and to offer them gender reassignment surgery? Is that what we want in our country and our children? This is all unacceptable to us. We have a different future of our own. So this is the West to him, the left. Now, yeah, I mean, I don't want children to have gender reassessment surgery, but I can separate that from the fact that we in the West are much freer than Russia in every respect. And yes, we need to fight the left, but fight it under the terms of freedom, not by instituting religion, tradition, faith as our standards of value. But this is the satanic West. The West is the left. And the more he talks about the West as being the left, the more allies he gets in the West from the right. And I think today, you should have seen it on Twitter, and not only interestingly, not only conservatives, but libertarians, Tom Woods and many other libertarians, jumped all over me for condemning Putin, jumped all over me for condemning Russia, jumped all over me for supporting Ukraine. Tom Woods, many of you admire him. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. He's a moral subjectivist, an anarchist, an America hater. Why would it surprise us that he's pro-Putin and a religionist? That's Putin. That's Russia. There's no moral equivalency here. Not between Russia and Ukraine, and certainly not between Russia and America, even in America under Joe Biden. Even in America with Joe Biden as president. By the way, one, because most Americans wanted him over Donald Trump. Donald Trump, by the way, continues to compliment Putin, continues to claim he's brilliant, continues to claim that he will ultimately win. I mean, he certainly will win if Donald Trump gets elected president. They'll hand Ukraine over to him on a silver platter. All right, before I get to American interests and the risk of a nuclear war and any other issues that we might have or you might have with regard to Ukraine, Russia, U.S. relations, funding, all these weapon systems and everything. I encourage you to use the Super Chat to support the show. If you like what I do, if you value what I do, if you see any value in the things that I do, Twitter, here, talks, running around the world, giving talks about capitalism, freedom, liberty, objectivism, egoism, and the war, then use the Super Chat or use a sticker to support the show. We're way off target, which is okay. This is the second show today, but we're way off target. It would be nice to get some sign of support from you guys. Value for value. John asked in the chat, I'm just seeing this, okay, where the rational Russian leadership? Well, the rational Russian leadership has been eviscerated by Putin. They've been killed. They've been driven out of Russia. I mean, Garry Kasparov is a rational person. He is the chess champion. He is a leader. He's charismatic. He's an activist. But if he goes to Russia, he won't ever leave. His life is threatened even in the West by Russia. I mean, this is the thing. I don't get it. You can criticize, and all of you do, those of you on all sides of the political spectrum criticize Biden. You don't fear for your life. But somebody like Garry Kasparov criticizes Putin, he fears for his life. Fears for his life. Because that's the kind of regime Russia is. It's an evil regime that kills its opposition. It has basically zero freedom. It is considered, again, by Freedom House and pretty much by anybody who does any kind of ranking of freedom in the world, it's considered a consolidated authoritarian regime. A consolidated authoritarian regime. It scores 2 out of 100 in terms of measures of freedom. 2 out of 100. I haven't checked. I wonder how China scores. Probably less, but I'm not sure. Let's see. Let's see, just to give some comparison to other countries that might be authoritarian, right? Read more. Page not found. That can't be. The Chinese have hacked it and it doesn't exist anymore. I think I have to log in. I think I've exceeded my freebies. I think I have to get to log in. I'm curious if anybody wants to log into Freedom House and tell me how China ranks. That would be pretty cool. Oh, there it is. Oh, China ranks as not free, 9 out of 100. So China ranks freer than Russia in terms of civil liberties, lower in terms of political rights. Lower in terms of, well, about the same in internet and global freedom index. So, I mean, this is the country people are defending. I mean, vigorously defending. This is the regime people are admiring. This is a man that Jordan Peterson, one of the most influential intellectuals of our time, claims is the bastion of Western civilization. That indeed the West cannot win its battle against the left without Putin. All right, so North Korea is 3 out of 100. I'm not sure these are the same measures. Anyway, 0 political rights and 3 out of 60 civil liberties. China's way ahead of North Korea. In terms of both of those measures. China's, basically 0 in political rights, but 11 out of 60 in civil liberties. I guess Russia, let me get the right measure. I'm not sure that's the right measure. Yeah, let's try that one. All right, Russia has higher political rights. Yeah, Russia scores about the same as China. lower political rights, higher civil liberties, but overall not free, just like China, just like North Korea. This is who is being defended. All right. One of the most influential intellectuals of our time. All right, let's see. Still eager to get your support. Still eager to see an expression of the values that you think you're getting from the show. You can do that by doing a $20, $50, $100, $500 question on the Super Chat. That would be fantastic. Or those of you who can't afford that, $2, $5, $10 is good as well. Okay, quickly, let's talk about America. Look, if America was laissez-faire capitalist, if America actually had a proper foreign policy, a strategic foreign policy, then Russia would have never invaded Ukraine. Ukraine probably wouldn't be as corrupted as it is. It's not clear Russia would be as corrupted as it is. There would be a real shining city on a hill. There would be a real model. And the whole world would be a different place. We live, though, in a world where America has no strategy, has no foreign policy, shoots from the hip, and stands really for very little, relative freedom. It's relatively free. Certainly relative to Russia, it's free. So, and as part of that, the United States today is a member of NATO. Now, you could argue, and I have argued, that the United States should not be a member of NATO if it had a proper foreign policy. That is, if it was willing to defend itself properly, if it was willing to demand that the Europeans defend themselves, if it was willing to bring its troops home from 120 different countries where they are and only keep them where they are strategically necessary for America's interests, then I don't think there would be any need for America to be a member of NATO. And the Europeans, indeed, are rich enough to defend themselves. There's no reason they can't sustain NATO. I think NATO is a logical thing to have. NATO is absolutely an appropriate defense alliance for Europe against Russia, obviously a threat, but also against Iran potentially, Muslims, Islam in some form. Europeans share a common geographic area. They share, in broad sense, a common culture. And they have common enemies. And an alliance makes sense. A threat to Poland is also a threat to Germany. Maybe less of a threat to Portugal, but still a threat. So all of those countries should be aligned in a defense treaty. So in an ideal world, the United States would not be a member of NATO. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in the world in which we live. Like it or not, the United States is a part of NATO and has treaty obligations as part of that. For example, part of its obligations are to send troops to defend Estonia if Estonia is invaded. Part of its obligations are to defend Poland if Poland is invaded. Part of its obligation is to provide Europe with a nuclear umbrella and a nuclear defense. So America, like it or not, is obligated in Europe militarily. In that context, Russia invading Ukraine is a clear threat to the rest of Europe. Here is an aggressor nation, a nation with imperial ambitions, doesn't hide them, talks about them all the time. A nation that is hostile to the West, hostile to Europe. A nation that has done everything in its power to make Europe dependent dependent on it for its natural, for example, for natural gas, for energy, and has said and done, basically used that as a weapon. Russia is a threat to Europe. And Russia being a threat to Europe means that Europe has every incentive, every motivation to make sure Russia doesn't win. If Russia wins in Ukraine, Russia could easily start a war in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. If Russia wins in Ukraine, it suddenly takes Georgia. Russia wins in Ukraine and maybe takes Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. What's going to stop them from going from Poland? Well, the only thing stopping them is NATO. But NATO would rather not get into a full-out war with Russia. It doesn't want to get to the point where Russia invades Estonia and tries NATO. It doesn't want to get to the point where Russia invades Latvia and maybe the United States and Europe have to be involved. It's much cheaper, much more effective, much more productive, much less likely to lead to World War III. I'll say this again. Much less likely to lead to World War III if Russia is defeated in Ukraine. A Russian defeat in Ukraine eliminates the possibility that they would invade Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia. A Russian defeat in Ukraine makes it impossible to imagine that Russia would be willing to go up against NATO. A Russian defeat in Ukraine weakens Russia for decades. Decades. The cost is trivial if that's what's achieved. And the risk of a nuclear war starting because Russia would start it because Ukraine is defeating it on the battlefield is basically zero. The Russian regime is not suicidal. Russian generals are not suicidal. They have nothing to gain by using nukes. I mean, maybe a small tactical nuke because they think the West would not respond. But they have nothing to gain even from that because at that point NATO would get involved and NATO would wipe them out in days. There's nothing to gain. Now the United States is part of NATO. Like it or not, by treaty we're obligated to defend Europe. The last thing in the world we want to have to do is send our young boys to fight in the fields of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. It's much cheaper for us in blood and in dollars, much cheaper for us to send weapon systems we probably won't use ever again anyway. And to finance, to some extent, a Ukrainian war against Russia where Ukrainian will win and therefore take Russia off the table as a threat to Europe and therefore to the United States in the decades to come. I mean, you don't really understand how devastating a defeat of Russia in Ukraine would be to the Russians. It would pacify them for a long time. Not forever, necessarily, but for a long time. And that should be the goal. The goal should be to defeat Russia. And in that sense, Biden should have authorized F-16s a year ago. He should have authorized tanks a year ago. He should have authorized cluster bombs a year ago. He should have given the Ukrainians all the means. And in this sense, it is immoral what's being done. We should have given them every means possible to defeat the Russians as quickly, as thoroughly as possible in Ukraine without going into Russia. Because that's the one thing that could trigger a broader war, is an invasion by Ukraine of Russia. But that's not on the cards. So it's the cowardice of Americans, the fact that we're not willing to go all in, that is dragging this war out, that is killing Ukrainians, that is killing Russians, and that is actually increasing the risk. Russia is an enemy. Clearly, unequivocally an enemy. It is invaded a sovereign state. It has invaded a sovereign state for zero reason other than its ties as one nation and to back up its own political regime at home. It has invaded a nation that was moving to the West, that was becoming part of Europe, that was freeing up its people, moving in the right direction. Still corrupt, still problematic, still behind, but moving in the right direction. Russia's moving in the wrong direction, has been since 2000, since Putin took control. Certainly since 2012. And again, a nuclear war is much more likely, on orders of magnitude more likely, if Russia wins. That will embolden them. That will embolden them to take out, to challenge NATO. And then you're much more likely to get a war. So no, not only is our support justified, we should be doing more of it, at least. And it's so cheap for us. It's super cheap. We're sending them weapons systems. I've talked about this on several shows. We're sending them weapons systems we are not using. We won't use. Indeed, the cluster bombs are almost expired. If you use them, you get a stomach ache. Putin and Russia need to be humiliated. And they need to be defeated. And that is a step towards peace. That is a step towards a safer world. One of the lessons learned there, China probably doesn't invade Taiwan. Indeed, the fact that the West has stood so firm with Ukraine is probably one of the reasons China is not taking this opportunity to invade Taiwan. So, no, there's nothing. America has clear interest given the constellation, geopolitical constellation, and given out commitment to NATO. A clear incentive to stop Putin now instead of stopping Putin with our own tanks, with our own troops, with the bodies of our own kids. All right, now I probably alienated I don't know how many people, but please, those of you who agree with me, do me this favor. Share this show. Share my rants. People need to hear this. Nobody says this. Nobody out there is actually talking about the Ukraine war from the perspective of American interests, from the perspective of the evil that is Putin and his Russia. Nobody is talking from the perspective of what would happen if he actually won in Ukraine. What would be the chain of events? And how that puts the world at much greater risk than if he is defeated in Ukraine. Well, let's hope that the defeat will lead to an actual regime change. And everybody's giving Biden a hard time about him wanting regime change. Absolutely, he should want regime change. We should be advocating for regime change. I mean, not executing the regime change ourselves, but absolutely. I don't want Putin to be the head of Russia, and I don't think any sane person should want that. All right. I don't know. If anybody's willing to listen, it was very depressing over the weekend to see the extent and the prevalence of just irrationality and very discouraging. On the right, you expect it from the left. On the right. All right, quick reminder that supporting the show is supporting the show, showing the value for value, trading with me. Please, we've got 90 people watching, $4 each, $5 each, and we're done. We're at our target. You can use a sticker to do that. You can just use a sticker. Don't even have to ask a question, or you can ask a question. Let's make questions from now on, given that it's late. $20 or more. So thank you for all the people who ask questions for $2, $4, $5, $10. But no more under $20 questions. Let's make all the questions from now on $20 or more. You can still use a sticker to support the show without asking a question. So please continue to do that. All right. Let's see. Let's do some of these questions. Let's start with Jennifer. Why do so many people think NATO is somehow a threat to world peace? Well, because they think the U.S. is a threat to world peace. I mean, most people on the new right, and certainly most libertarians, anarchists, believe that the greatest threat to peace in the world is the United States of America. They believe that the United States of America is responsible for most of the wars in the world. It's responsible for all the problems in the world, and it is responsible for devastation and horror everywhere around the world. Whether it's in, whether it's going back to 19th century, the West occupying China, all the way to the Korean Vietnam Wars, to and of course to the U.S. Involvement in the Middle East. None of that is portrayed as self-defense. Certainly none of it is portrayed in terms of civilized versus uncivilized. I mean, this goes back to my Rothbard, who basically supported the North Vietnamese over the South Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. And claiming that in many respects, Stalin was better than America. So there is a deep, deep hatred of the U.S., hatred of America. And I think ultimately hatred of America and what it stands for, that permeates many in the libertarian world. The anarchists again. I don't want to paint the brush of all libertarians, but certainly the anarchists, they hate America because America is a affront to their belief that you can only have civilization under anarchy. That everything has to be in anarchy and chaos. The prosperity, the amazing lives that people have in relatively free countries like the United States is just an affront to them. So you see that all over the place. America is the villain. And that really drives much of their perspective. And of course, many of them come from this traditionalist, religious, mystical background. And the liberties that we have, the individual liberties that we have, the liberalism that we have in our day-to-day lives, in our sexual behavior, and just the way we live our lives, is an affront to them. They want us all to be good Christians. Libertarian, but all good Christians. Libertarians under anarchy, right? But all good Christians. It's a strange world out there. And in a sense, it's way, way earlier than most people think in terms of the evolution of the culture, the evolution of our society. We are way, way too early for real liberty and real freedom. It's just not comprehensible for most of the culture around us. What we have is tribalism, collectivism of various forms, suppressed for the most part. But then they pop out whenever there's too much challenge. Too much challenge. Thank you, Jennifer. Adam says, what should have been our response to Russia blowing up the big dam? Why did we not give Ukrainian long-range missiles to hit value-added Russian targets? Ships that launch missiles on Ukraine, Kertch bridge. I mean, my opinion is we're cowards. We haven't given them F-16s. We haven't given them, it took them a long time to get them tanks or to get them artillery, long-range artillery. Yeah, I mean, and the more we delay with missiles and other things like that, the more people are going to die. The longer this war will go. Instead of winning quickly and decisively, we're dragging this out. And it truly is a horror. It truly is a horror. And of course, it's all under the framing of we don't want to piss off Russia because we don't want a nuclear war. Russia doesn't want a nuclear war either. Pissing off Russia, that's a virtue, not a vice. Ryan says, I think that an anti-war stance is nonsensical and a cop-out because it suggests one is evading having to make a moral judgment. Do you think if people view all politicians as crooks, that it makes it easy for them to defend a thug? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, Ryan. Absolutely. They don't want to make moral judgments. So it's much easier to say, well, they're all corrupt. But I like Putin. Right? They're all immoral, but I like this strong man. No, you have to make moral judgments, which mean that person is better than that person. That person's pretty good. That person's evil. Evil. Can't do that in the culture in which we live. And yes, absolutely, it's a cop-out, and it's about evading real moral judgment and exposing what your moral judgment really is. Maybe it turns out that many of these right-wingers love authoritarianism, love totalitarianism, and love, because they're fundamentally subjectivist, they love religiosity and mysticism. Maybe. And if they were more explicit about it, we would know. We would know. It would be out there, up front, and not hidden. But by brushing everybody with the same brush, they don't have to make nuanced judgments. They don't actually have to tell you what they actually think. Daniel says, last week you denounced Des Moines, Iowa, for a place to hold OCON. I did. Wouldn't it be substantial to hold one during Iowa caucuses? Since Iowa kicks off the presidential nomination for both parties, lots of media press love the show. No, because the last thing you want is to be associated with the caucuses of either one of these parties or with the whole caucus process. The whole thing is ridiculous. Who cares? I mean, we're not in politics. We're not doing politics. And all we'll get asked by the media is, who are you endorsing? Who are you supporting? Who do you... Nobody. And then they'll stop the interview and walk away. No, we need to avoid election season. Let the craziness happen. Let us stand on principle from a distance. Those of you who want to get involved in politics, all the power to you. But not the Ayn Rand Institute. Not OCON. And by the way, it seems pretty, yeah. We're going to go through caucuses, but it seems pretty obvious who's going to win at this point, right? Putin's buddy. Putin's buddy. Maybe two of Putin's buddy. Wouldn't it be amazing if we had RFK and Trump? I mean, how would you choose then? Lewis says, which individual has done the most to promote Rand's ideas, excluding yourself and peikoff? Excluding myself and peikoff, which individual has done more to promote Ayn Rand's ideas? Well, I mean, you'd have to say Harry Binswanger or Onkar Gate. I think Onkar, with the work he does in the background, the training of new intellectuals, the work he did with me. And then Harry, of course, over many, many years, the constant work to get objectivism out there into the culture. So I'd say those two, Harry and Onkar, would be the two. Lewis also asks, why do most Americans, especially young... Oh, by the way, James, wow. James just did $277. I don't know why 277. Is there something symbolic there? But that is amazing. Thank you. Thank you for the support. It truly is amazing. Daniel Ritpath, no. First of all, it wasn't Daniel Ritpath. It was John Ritpath. And no, I don't think John Ritpath did as much as Harry or Onkar to promote objectivism. He was a great speaker, and he did a lot, and he brought some Toronto students to it, but he wasn't kind of as influential in the culture as those two. Andrew Bernstein, certainly not. Maybe, again, some inspiring talks that he's given over the years and brought people in, but to compare him, I think Onkar, with the influence he's had at the Institute, has done much more than that. And the same with James Valiant. I mean, James Valiant, has an audience, again, not diminishing anybody, but has an audience on YouTube that's fairly small and hasn't brought that many people into the movement and hasn't changed the movement in profound ways as I think Harry and Onkar have. So no, I mean, nobody comes close. And certainly none of these people. Stossel is not an objectivist, and he hasn't done much. He's given some exposure to Ayn Rand, but no, I mean, Stossel's not an influence to bring objectives. Raka Ali has a big audience, there's no question, but most of the audience Raka Ali has is around his rap comedy stuff, not necessarily about his not around the big audience is not around objectivism, it's around the other stuff. Stossel, because he gave us a platform, not because he is an objectivist. Jennifer says she found me through Stossel. I didn't realize that. I forgot that. You've probably told me, but I forgot that. But no, I mean, you guys have no appreciation. I know you don't have any appreciation for Onkar. And, you know, because he's in the background. But I couldn't be what I am without Onkar. And the same with Harry. I mean, Harry taught me. He was my professor. And Harry was also there, you know, both in the background, but also in the forefront. So yes, I am the guy who's out there, and other than Peikoff and Rand, I brought more people, new people, to objectivism than anybody. I don't know who else comes close in terms of bringing new people to objectivism. But again, after Rand and Peikoff, not competing. But in terms of having an influence, there are many people in the background who have profound influences. All right, back to Lewis's question. Why do most Americans have a completely distorted view of the world, history, and America's role? They think Europe is just as rich and hate no idea about capitalism's role in America's success. Yeah, because we don't teach them that. They don't know history. They don't know geography. You ever studied geography in school? Do you know anything about geography? They don't know where Europe is. I've told this story before. I'll tell it again. When I came to the U.S. in 1974, I attended 8th grade in what was considered one of the best schools in America in Brookline, Massachusetts. I went to the same school as Dukakis' kids went to. I know most of you don't know who Dukakis was, but he was the governor at some point of Massachusetts and the mayor of Boston. And in one of the classes, this is 1974, Vietnam War has just ended. Vietnam War, traumatic for America, important for America, huge for America. In the news every night. And what do you call it? The teacher asked the kids, who can point to Vietnam on a map? Not a single kid in the class, not one single kid in the class could point to Vietnam, except me. I was a kid from Israel. I had no interest in Vietnam, but I knew geography. I knew where the countries of the world are. You know, people challenge you with these tests of they show you a blank map of Europe. Can you name the countries? Yeah, I can. Most of Asia, maybe not all. Some Africa, not all. Almost all of South America and even Central America. I can name every single country. And that's not me bragging. That's Israelis we studied geography. And we studied history. And Americans have no clue. Now, beyond that, I do blame the kids and the parents, because they lack, because of the way they were raised and because of the culture, they lack curiosity about the world. Part of the problem is Americans are raised to think that America is it. Nothing in the world matters. America's everything. Certainly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that's the view. The rest of the world is insignificant. Only thing that matters. Americans don't travel much. Certainly never used to. They travel more today, maybe. But they don't travel much. How many countries have the Americans in the audience been to? How many languages do the Americans in the audience know? I only know 2, so I shouldn't talk. But my wife knows 6. And Europeans know many. And they travel. They see the world. They go to other European countries. They go to other places. They go to Asia. They go to America. So the reason is bad educational system, Even now, Europeans have a bad educational system too, in the sense of they don't understand the role of capitalism. They don't understand the role of the 19th century in making them as rich as they are. They don't understand any of that. But in America, you expect better. But the same intellectual currents that influence Europe and make Europeans ignorant about the true nature of their history play out in the United States. And then add to that the fact that the American educational system doesn't really teach history and doesn't teach geography, and the Americans don't seem to be that interested in either one of those. You've got a real problem. So Spyman says he speaks 3 languages and has been to 5 different countries, and he's 20. That's great. I think I lived in 5 different countries by the time I was 20. That's not fair, right? But yeah, Americans need to travel more. And I'm not talking about my audience, which is probably way above average. Europeans would struggle naming states in America. Sure, states are not countries. Europeans would probably name more states in America than Americans could name countries in Europe, would be my guess. I just think they're better educated. Their educational system is better. We have a progressive educational system in this country that doesn't teach facts, that doesn't teach anything, really. Our kids score lower on math scores than Europeans, lower on science scores than Europeans. So no, we have a lousy educational system. Thank the philosophers of education that have dominated. Dewey, thanks Dewey, the American philosopher Dewey, for the fact that we have a horrible educational system in this country. And that goes above and beyond the fact that all our teachers are leftists, but that's true in Europe as well. And yet, at least in Europe, they have a system that is better, because they've adopted less of the progressive agenda. All right, that was a long answer. All right, we got a lot of questions. Gail says, when I lived in Moscow in the late 90s in a JV with GasProm, I could see it then. One big box first store was hit during the day by a SWAT team, and I saw a murder of 2 young people. We lost money in Russia because of corruption. Yeah, I mean, and 90s was particularly bad. One of the things that Russians love about Putin is he at least brought order to the chaos that was the 90s. 90s were a horrible time in Russia for a variety of reasons we could get into at some point, or somebody can ask me in a question. Spyman 3000, you should try and get Razorfist on your show to discuss things with. I don't know who Razorfist is. He has been increasingly sympathetic to objectivism recently. He is, however, unfortunately also sympathetic to irrational stance the right takes. So many people like that. So many people like that. It's truly sad. Daniel says, you probably have spoken about it. What is your opinion of the Marshall Plan after World War II? How would an objectivist leader handle it after the destruction of Europe? I think the Marshall Plan was a mistake. It was a disaster. I think the United States hurt Europe ultimately with the Marshall Plan, and also hurt Europe because of the economic policies that the United States imposed on Europe. Do you know that Germany became a relatively free market because the German finance minister secretly basically took Germany off price controls and regulations that the Americans had imposed without letting the Americans know, so they wouldn't be able to have time to object to it. I can't remember the year of it, but it's an amazing story. I forget his name too, which is an injustice. But he was an amazing guy who basically said the Americans don't know what they're talking about economically. They're running this like a socialist place, and he basically took Germany off in one day off of price controls and set Germany on a path to ultimately recovery and riches. Adenauer. Thank you, Warner Freeman. Adenauer. And this is in spite of the Americans. So how would the Americans tend to it? They would have basically established laissez-faire constitutions across Europe, encouraged, certainly in Germany, which was open to reform, and instead of imposing price controls and basically socialism over Germany, America should have imposed laissez-faire capitalism. and let them become rich by trading with them. They would have become rich even faster, I think. So no, I'm very much against the Marshall Plan. I'm very much against Marshall Plans generally. I'm against foreign aid that's not directly military and military aid only to countries that are clearly our allies and fighting our wars, like Israel and Europe and Ukraine in this case. But again, no dollars, no money, just military equipment. James says, and $277. Thank you again, James. By the way, we're only $58 short of our goal. So maybe a couple of, three $20 questions and we're there. How do you see the U.S. evolving over the next 5 years? 5 years. 5 years. Wow, that's one election. It appears the country is only getting more political. And us versus them mentality. Are there any things you are excited about happening in that time period? Anything that makes you think we are on the wrong track? Wrong track? Everything makes me think we're in the wrong track. So, over the next 5 years, I think we inch closer to authoritarianism. I think our political culture deteriorates even further. I think hatred of the Supreme Court on both left and right will increase significantly over the next 5 years because it'll turn out that the Supreme Court will not please either left or right. Because it's better than both in some senses. I just see things getting significantly worse over the next 5 years. I don't see any other options. Trump could be president in 2 years. If he isn't, then Biden might be president in 2 years. Neither one of those things is good. A second term of Biden, particularly if he can hold on to a Senate or House, or if he can take the Senate and the House, is a disaster. And Republicans are very much capable of losing the Senate and the House because they're so politically stupid, is a good term for that. So I don't see anything positive in American politics today. I just don't see it. Maybe the potential rise of a third party, if it happens, but I don't know that it will. If they can get any kind of traction, real traction, significant traction, maybe that'll wake up the other two parties. I don't know. And there does seem to be some energy behind a third party, but we'll see if it manifests. I don't see anything politically. The things that I get excited about have to do with artificial intelligence. They have to do with biotech, longevity, things around health, and things around technology, things around entrepreneurship and innovation. I fear that we're going to have less of it, and I know we're going to have less of it than we could, but less of it than less of it in the future than we do today because of all these policies. But those are the things that make me excited. The entrepreneurial ventures that people are engaged in that are going to improve all of our lives. In politics, I see nothing positive. I mean, who? The few candidates I think are decent are getting no traction, zero. Stringer Bell, what are your thoughts on an individual developing principles around one's personality profile, such as Myers-Briggs, or talent profile, such as StrengthsFinder? I don't know StrengthsFinder. I know a little bit about Myers-Briggs. I don't think it's particularly useful. I think you really need to study yourself. You need to study what really drives you, really study what your values are. Study what energizes you. Evaluate it. Not morally, judge it. Is it good? Is it bad? Yeah, it wasn't the other guy that one of Freeman said, Adenauer. It was Earhart, who was the finance minister. He was the amazing guy. If the personality profiles help you in some way introspect and get a deeper understanding. But you can change your personality. You can change your scores on those. I think much more important is to get in touch with who you are and get to know you in a deep, deep sense. Create a real hierarchy of values. Figure out what those look like and understand why you value what you value. And make sure it's rational and consistent and integrated so it's one system of values. I think that's much more important in terms of individual development. And hard. It takes time. And I don't know that Myers-Briggs or anything really provides much of a shortcut to that. Maybe it provides more insight into it, but it doesn't provide much of a shortcut. Lewis, what do you make of the comment saying I don't judge or I don't judge a book by its cover? I cringe when I hear it, but can't put my finger on it. Well, I don't judge a book by its cover is fine because that's right. You judge a book by the content. You want to have information to judge. But I think I don't judge is one of the great problems in our culture. Judge, 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 and be ready to be judged. To not judge is to abandon reason. To not judge is to abandon justice. To not judge is to abandon life. You have to judge. It's a requirement of your survival. Your life depends on judging what's good, what's bad, who's a good guy, who's a bad guy, who's evil, who's hurtful, who might do you harm, who is good, you should support, you should encourage, you should help. These kind of decisions are foundational to our existence, foundational to our happiness. And they require judging all the time. So be a judge. Constantly judge other people. Now, do it on the basis of facts, on the basis of reason, not emotion, on the basis of knowledge, right? So do it right. Do it objectively. But absolutely you should judge. Whew, all right. Still got a bunch of questions. This is the $5 to $10 ones. All right. Sush up. I'm originally from Ukraine and now in California. It was great to see everyone seeing the war how it is at first. Then the right got hooked on Russian conspiracies. Yes. Pretty stunning, huh? Pretty stunning. Thank you for the super chat. And I'm glad you're in California, not Ukraine. Colt Savage, I mean this figuratively, but I feel like the right has run me out of town with their ridiculous anti-Ukraine nonsense. I'm just so sick and tired of it. They don't even make good arguments. I know. It's horrible. I feel for you because I know you're surrounded by people who are on the right in your community. It's difficult. Kim A says, in an objectivist society, would the government ban you as a private citizen business from trading with Russia? I think in the circumstances, yes. Once we define Russia as an enemy, you wouldn't be allowed to trade with them. Non-enemy? See, today they won't do that, right? We still have an embassy in Russia. We still have diplomatic relations. We still pretend that they're a legitimate regime, even though they've just invaded a country and threatened the world, right? So in an objective society, we wouldn't have had an embassy. Trump would have never met with Putin. And if Putin engaged in a war that was a threat to our interests, yes, we would have banned people from trading with him. You don't trade with an enemy. Trade with an enemy is aiding and abetting. Aiding and abetting. Okay, Wesley, what's your opinion on John Mearsheimer? He insists Russia will win because of advantages in artillery and population. Well, you know what my opinion is because I think he's wrong. I think he was wrong in his evaluation of Russia as, in a sense, having a legitimate strategic reason to attack Ukraine because of that the whole attack was about NATO, and it wasn't. I think that's nonsense. I think he like most analysts out there, don't understand the role of ideas in history. They don't understand the role of Russian philosophy and Russian ideology. They don't understand Russia's view of Ukraine specifically. They don't have an understanding of the strategic layout of Europe, and therefore, they think that Russia can Russia is worried about NATO being in Ukraine, but not worried about NATO being in Finland. I mean, I just think the guy is not a good thinker about these things, but it doesn't surprise me. You have to have a certain perspective on the role of ideas. You have to have a real strategic vision of what's going on that is not realist, that is not, that is value-laden. Value-laden. They think that their science needs to be value-free. And then Russia's not going to win because it doesn't have an advantage in artillery. It's artillery, they have more of them, but they're less accurate, they're less effective, they're much more vulnerable to attack. And artillery doesn't win wars. Artillery does not win wars. And I still think that Ukraine will make significant advances on the fronts in the months to come. It's going to be slow, but they will make significant advances in the months to come, particularly if they get F-16s into the air, and particularly, and now that they've got these new munitions, but they're going to make progress, and they're already making progress. They're going to make more progress. So no, I don't think Russia is going to win. And as I've said, Russia's already lost, and that's, people don't get that. Russia's already lost. Europe now knows it's not reliant on Russia for energy. That is a major loss for Russia. Major loss for Russia. Russia's having to sell its oil over the world for discounted prices. Major loss for Russia. And Russia's lost hundreds of thousands of its own population. Many of them will never come back. Some of the most talented. They've seen a massive brain drain out of Russia because of this war. They'll never get that back. And I could go on and on with the losses that Russia has suffered. We're only $22 short of our goal, by the way. Mark says, maybe moral subjectivity has a cognitive angle. Dr. Pat Churchland posits relationship between science and reasoning. Have you heard of her? No, I haven't. But the problem with them is they don't really have a proper grasp of reason. I wonder if she believes in free will. And there's a big difference. How do you define subjectivity? What does subjectivity actually mean? Do you mean individual judgment? Or do you mean subjectivity as in lack of objectivity, lack of reasoning, as going by emotion or going by faith? That's subjectivity. The negation of truth, the negation of facts. Justin says, how did Trump become a successful businessman when he is clearly irrational and incompetent? Well, I mean, he's not irrational and incompetent in every aspect of his life. He very much understands how to run a political campaign. He very much understands how to manipulate people. And what Trump's strengths are in real estate is he's a brilliant marketer. He is brilliant at marketing, right? And marketing is about understanding people and manipulating people to some extent, right? They still have free will. They can avoid your manipulation, but he's good at it. Giving them what they want. And he's very good at that. He understands people in some deep sense, in that sense. Very second-handed. But yeah, I mean, he's good at marketing. And he wasn't that good of a businessman. He was good, but he wasn't that good. I mean, again, he inherited a lot of money. If he just invested in New York real estate, he would have made just as much money as he has. It appears. Nobody knows how much money he has. Nobody knows exactly what he's worth. So you can't really make these analyses. But it appears that given what he inherited, wouldn't taken much for him to be as rich as he is today. Not to screw it up. So he's a decent businessman. He's not a brilliant one. Megan says, I'm excited for the interview with with Professor Lennox. Me too. Very much looking forward to it. Linda, Zelensky sounds like Churchill. Give us the tools, we'll finish the job. Yes. And yet, the right hates him. But the right also hates, one of the comments I got on Twitter was, Churchill should have been prosecuted as a war criminal. I guess because of the bombing of Dresden, I don't know. But that's some libertarians for you. Catherine says, thank you, Yaron. Thank you, Catherine. Colt says, I'm only 22 with no money. Do I get a pass for not traveling as much? All I know is English and some Russian. I'm also a geography nerd. I agree with you. America needs to do better with geography. Yeah, I mean, yes, you get a pass. You're only 22. But you should travel. You should make that as a goal in life. And you should find the resources. You know, you can hitchhike around the world. You can travel with very little money. You can stay at hostels and you can go around Europe on a train pass. You can see the world without having to spend a lot of money. And I encourage people to do that. It's a lot of fun and it's super interesting. Lewis, for $20, getting us $2 short. What does it take for the world to embrace individualism again? What allowed it to happen 200 years ago? I feel the culture is drifting further apart. Ayn Rand, Google search trends are down since the 2000s. What allowed it to happen 200 years ago is basically a scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. What allowed it to happen 200 years ago was the discovery of reason, the embrace of reason. Fundamental to individualism is reason. We need to teach people to value their mind, teach people to value objective thinking, teach people about reality, facts, evidence, logic, thinking. Only when individuals can think for themselves, only when they value thinking for themselves and value human rationality and reason, do they develop into individualists, because now they know they can deal with life, they can cope with the world. So we don't have time to do it right now, but in many of my talks I go over this. There's a clear progression from valuing reason to valuing your own mind to valuing making your own choices to wanting the freedom and the liberty to make those choices. But it starts with reason. And the more the culture becomes mystical, the more it becomes religious, the more it becomes faith-based, the more it becomes, what was the word I was thinking of? Anyway, mystical at whatever level that is, superstitious, the less individualistic it becomes. The more emotion dominates reason, the more faith dominates reason, the more collectivist the culture becomes. The less you can rely on your own mind and you have to gang up with a bunch of other people to make decisions. Or ultimately, the ultimate collectivism, wait until somebody tells you what to do. All right, thank you guys. Wow, we made it to 650 to a large extent because of James, but also because a lot of $20 questions. Wes, thank you, Wes, for the $50. A lot of stickers, a lot of questions. You guys were great. 2 hours, just under 2 hours for the show. We made our target. We beat our target this morning. We're doing fantastic. We need to keep this up so that this show is self-sustaining. Let me remind you, I am looking for people to businesses to sponsor the show. If you have a product or a service you would like advertised on the show, I'm recruiting sponsors. So let me know, Yaron@yaronbrookshow.com, Yaron@yaronbrookshow.com, and we can negotiate kind of a deal. So please consider having your business sponsor the Yaron Brook Show. All right, guys, I'll see you all tomorrow morning. Oh, another question quickly. Do you think that American right has been, subverted by Russian propaganda? I think the American right has been, but they've allowed themselves to be by their mindlessness. There's already an underlying issue with their ideology, but do you think that the claims of Russian interference had any validity? Oh yeah, of course Russian interference happened. There's no question about that. But so what, right? I mean, I have no problem with Russian interference. Misinformation, it's your responsibility to judge the information you get and the information you're going to act on and to evaluate it as being true or false. You can't just accept propaganda. And Russian propaganda is Russian propaganda. There are lots of it. But you don't blame the propaganda, you blame the people who embrace it. Thank you, guys.